Okay, so I'm going to try and fill a little bit more time here because I have good news and I have bad news, right? So which one do you want first? The bad. You guys are also conditioned for bad news. Okay, so the bad news is, well, let me just start by describing. This is going to be a gentle introduction to the concept of the real-world security value of CMMC. And by gentle is a way of describing it. It's still very involved. The idea here is that we're going to try and collectively sort of turn the corner on our understanding of these NIST requirements as assessed by CMMC. Technically, my real job should be talking about the security value of the requirements that CMMC assesses, but as soon as we started talking about that 3 years ago, people were like, let me stop you right there. I don't believe you. I don't think this is going to happen. I don't think we're going to be made to do it. And so then I had to get super familiar with the wild and wonderful world of rulemaking for a couple of years, and that's all I really talked about. So now that we're all, I hope, pretty well convinced that rulemaking is not a myth and that it's actually almost done, we can get back to what we were supposed to be talking about like 3 or 4 years ago. When you implement these requirements and when CMMC proves that you've implemented them, what do you get? What have you spent all this money on? What have you spent all this time on? What do the requirements actually do from a security perspective? Okay, so that's the idea of what the talk is going to go over. So there's a bunch of different material that we're going to have to cover to get everybody on the same page, but it is a little bit involved. You do not have to have a technical security background to understand the resources that we're going to talk about, so please do not be intimidated if you see acronyms that are on the screen because all the resources are very accessible. The good news is that our friend Scott Goodwin, pen tester extraordinaire, the reason why we have technical breakouts to begin with is going to do a complimentary session to this material demonstrating the things that we'll be talking about in terms of the actual bad guy techniques and how the controls that you are required to implement will help to mitigate the effectiveness of Scott doing his job. Okay, so it's sort of a twofer, right? We're going to do the intro here and then there's going to be a deeper dive follow on in the technical breakout after lunch. Okay, pretty much everybody's in the room. So let's get started. All right, so if you notice in this headshot, I still had hair, and I don't have hair now, because the #1 most annoying thing on the planet to me, other than comparing In-N-Out to Shake Shack, which is not a good comparison, is when people say, compliance is not security. Who said that? I know you all have, it's fine, put your hands down. You put your hand down. Okay, so when you say compliance is not security, we just want to get this out of the way to begin with. That is not a good thing to say to an ecosystem full of people who do not believe that they should be doing the requirements in the first place. It is deeply unhelpful, and as we'll show through this presentation, it's mostly not true. Even if, despite the DoD's best efforts, the effectiveness of the standard is mostly accidental, I would just encourage everyone in here, especially the security-minded folks, when you say compliance is not security, and this is just compliance, it harms the ecosystem because it makes people think even more that they don't need to be doing it, right? So just think about that as we go through some of the material here. Okay, so we are going to talk about the real-world security value of CMMC. And in order to do that, there are some big picture ideas that we need to all get on the same page for. We need to understand the basic structure and context that 853 is designed to be used in because, as I've probably heard me say in the past, it fundamentally drives the nature of the CMMC program and the requirements in 800, 171, and 172 that get verified by it. We also need to understand at a basic level the nature of advanced persistent threats because that's the rhetoric that gets used even throughout conferences like these. We're trying to stop nation states, right? We're trying to start advanced threats from stealing sensitive information, and there's going to be some wiggle room in that idea. Then we need to understand how we went from this concept of 853 and APTs down to the 800, 171 standard, which is what the vast majority of everybody under CMMC is going to have to implement. And then we're going to have to introduce a new concept to most people in here, most likely, is the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is a database that actually documents what real-world bad guys do when they do real-world bad guy stuff. From there, we're going to connect the dots and show how effective 853 and thus 800, 171 is to real-world bad guy stuff that real-world bad guys do, right? We're going to take compliance and we're going to show how much security you get. Then we have some key takeaways for industry. We have key takeaways for NIST. I know you're listening. And we have key takeaways for DoD. I know you're using fake user IDs in the virtual attendees. Okay, so understanding 853, we'll try and make this as painless as possible. Okay, so 853 is a catalog of controls. Think of this as a dictionary, right? Think of this as a toolbox full of tools. It is a catalog of controls that is designed to be used in the larger risk management framework context is probably the term that you've heard described. It's SP 837 if you want to check it out on your own. The catalog of controls is designed to be used in that larger context. It by itself is just a database, if you will, of security controls. And as they say in the first 3 chapters, which I encourage everyone to read, I still maintain that probably 90% of the questions that come up around CMMC could be solved if people just read the first 3 chapters of 853. Pro tip. So they say the purpose of the publication is to provide guidelines for selecting from the database and then specifying the details of those controls. That's the ODP part that everybody's becoming more familiar with in 800-171 Rev 3. And then they go on to say that this catalog of controls can be used to effectively deal with traditional and advanced persistent threats. Now this is a little bit, in my opinion, of a dated way of describing it because it makes it seem like there's a distinction these days between traditional and advanced threats. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, the cyber arms race has been going on for so long that nowadays script kiddie tools are pretty advanced. So I'm not actually sure how useful that distinction is anymore. But like they say, you can theoretically use this gigantic document to help deal, or at least in some way mitigate, the advanced persistent threat. Okay, so when you crack open 853, which I encourage everyone to do, you'll see things that look like this. NIST controls come in 2 forms. They come in base controls and they come in control enhancements. Control enhancements, you guessed it, enhance controls, right? They strengthen or otherwise change and modify the base control. The rule of thumb here is you must implement the base control if you want to implement the enhancement, right? You can't have one without the other. Very important for you to remember later. When you look at this base control here, totally random example that you don't need to remember for later in the presentation, SI4, Information System Monitoring, you'll see a bunch of what are known as control items that are lettered and then sub-items that are numbered. So this is what an 853 control looks like. For those of you who've read ahead and looked at 800-171, you might notice they're a little bit longer than the requirements that you are dealing with, right? And we're going to talk about how that happened. Okay, so over the years, 853 has existed for now going on 20 years, and it has increased dramatically over the last few years. Specifically, ever since Revision 3 came out, the catalog has expanded pretty much to a humongous degree. And here, this is just showing the fact that the catalog is actually made up of many more control enhancements than actual base controls. So the dark gray boxes along the bottom, the number of base controls actually really hasn't expanded all that much. It's the number of enhancements that you can pick and choose from based off of your situation, based off of your risk assessment, based off of the particular threats that you're facing to tailor the base controls for your particular environment, right? It is not a standalone cover-to-cover document. It's designed to be used in a larger context. These are just options that you have. The version that we're going to be focused on today is 853 Rev 4, because that's the one that 800-171 is derived from. 853 Rev 5 is the one that 800-171 Rev 3 is derived from, but we're not there yet, so we're just talking about the current standards. Okay, so within this humongous catalog of controls, now over 1,000, the Rev 4 version just under 1,000, they divide the catalog into baselines, low, moderate, and high baselines, as the starting point for this tailoring process of the larger catalog. And they say the first step in selecting and specifying security controls is to choose the appropriate security control baseline. It is the vanilla, generic starting point that you are going to start from and then build off of or take away from, depending on your situation, right? They are designed to be a starting point. It would be like if you opened a dictionary and you're like, how do I write a sentence? Where do you start? It's just a dictionary, doesn't tell you. They took a selection of words and they said, this is a decent place to start. Okay, and so these baselines, just like the overall catalog, have increased over the years as well. The one that we're going to be focused on is the moderate baseline in blue. If you've seen any of our presentations before, you'll know that the moderate baseline is the theoretical upper limit of what 800.171 can represent, and we'll talk about why in just a few moments. And so if we zoom in on those moderate baselines, you can see that it's maintained a relatively static number of base controls, and the ratio here of controls to control enhancements. So very important to remember that not all of the controls in the moderate baseline are base controls, right? They can come and go. They have relationships to each other even within this moderate baseline. Okay, so if you were to take the 853 Rev 4 moderate baseline, those 283 some odd controls and enhancements, and plot it out per family in 853, this is what it would look like. Because if you crack open 853, you might notice that it's like 500 pages long and there's no pictures. It's written for engineers by engineers. This is what the moderate baseline would look like. And those examples that we talked about earlier, SI4 and its control enhancement, that's what those red boxes are. So the ones that we were talking about, that big long control, just one of these boxes would be that control. So you have a bunch of them in the moderate baseline, but the moderate baseline in Rev 4 is just 31% of the overall catalog. So it is a massive dictionary, which is why if you ever hear anybody say the term 853 compliance, immediately throw a red flag in your mind that they don't know what they're talking about, because you would never be compliant with the whole dictionary, right? You're going to be compliant with a tailored version of a baseline, low, moderate, or high. Okay, so when NIST describes the baselines, they say these are good starting points, but they're assuming just a generic starting point. We haven't assumed anything specific, and there are limitations to these starting points. And some of those limitations where they may not be perfectly appropriate out of the box are if you have insider threats, if you have to deal with classified information, if you have to deal with advanced persistent threats, if you have some sort of specific legal or regulatory obligation, those moderate, low, high baselines may not be good to go by default. And so if any of those assumptions apply, as they say, additional controls would be needed. Additional controls, APTs, baseline, additional, right? Remember that equation here. So they go on to say in these first three chapters, situations requiring potential baseline supplementation, which means adding to the baselines, are advanced persistent threats, right? You guys see the pattern here? So what is an advanced persistent threat? Very briefly, NIST gives us a very NISTified, lengthy definition in the NIST glossary. If you're curious, the Wikipedia definition is perfectly fine. The way that we would describe this is security is inversely proportional to the amount of time and Mountain Dew that the bad guys have, and advanced persistent threats essentially have unlimited time and Mountain Dew. And so as a result, over a long enough period of time, they can essentially get to wherever they want to because they have more Mountain Dew than you do. That's what an advanced persistent threat might be, but check out the NIST glossary definition for reference afterwards. What does an advanced persistent threat look like? This is what they look like. So if you guys were reading the news a week or two ago, the DOJ announced an indictment against APT 31. Sometimes you'll hear them numbered, sometimes you'll hear them named specifically, and we've got their pictures because their security actually isn't as good as you would think. And so this is what they look like. You can go even to the FBI website and you can say, what do the bad guys actually look like who are doing stuff? So just to stop and say ni hao for a moment, the APT 40 guys here are known for going after biomedical, robotics, maritime and naval research. APT 41, higher education, healthcare, high tech, and telecom. And IRGC over here. Those are the guys trying to turn off the water, if you've been reading the news lately. That's what they look like, right? They're also aerospace and satellite targeting quite a bit. This is what they look like. The FBI website's got a list of all the APTs from all the countries, so if you want to know what the bad guys look like, here they are. Okay, so those are the bad guys. We got our starting point. We clearly need to add controls, right? Let's talk about 171. How did we end up with 171? So the very short version of the timeline, we had the CUI executive order back in 2010 that put NARA in charge of the federal CUI program. They issued a rule that implemented the program for all the agencies, and they said that we are going to categorize CUI at the moderate confidentiality level. So what do you think moderate level is going to put as our starting point? the moderate baseline, right? And we're going to talk about what the confidentiality word does here, but this establishes the theoretical upper limit through the miracle of government interpretation of policy, which is why when you read 800-171, they say, in accordance with this rule that was issued underneath the authority of this executive order, we are going to categorize it at no less than moderate confidentiality. And when you look at how they went from the moderate baseline, we're going in the wrong direction. We're going down. We were supposed to supplement up. And so there were a bunch of things that they changed in the tailoring process of the moderate baseline. They said, well, some of these controls are federal only. Some of these controls aren't related to confidentiality. Moderate confidentiality was the criteria. So we got rid of like 60 of those controls. As you may be familiar, the NFO controls, they're like, well, we just assume you're doing a bunch of stuff because you clearly are concerned about protecting your own data the way that we're concerned about you protecting our data. So we just won't specify those requirements. And you ended up with 126 of the original 283 controls. We then did some policy magic with some other documents and kind of blurred and mixed them together. For those of you who are familiar, these are the basic controls in 800-171. Essentially, 126 felt like too many, so they just kind of went and mushed them together, and then we got 110. And so if we overlay that tailoring criteria onto the moderate baseline, only the purple boxes are the ones that NIST considers to be relevant to protecting CUI confidentiality. And for reference, the red squares are the examples that we talked about earlier. And just for your reference as well, the stars here are the 853 controls that correspond to the 15 requirements in CMMC level 1. Okay, so does anybody see a problem here? Right? So the DoD's rhetoric that they've been using for years is advanced persistent threat, boogeyman, ooga booga booga, right? They're coming to get the data, and we've got to stop China, Russia, Iran. NIST says that if you're going to start at the moderate baseline and you want to deal with APTs, you need to add controls, and we took a bunch away. And to make matters worse, but wait, there's more, the controls in those purple boxes are not fully reflected in 800-171. So if we look at the corresponding requirement in 800-171 that maps to our example from earlier, SI4, Information System Monitoring, there are way fewer lines in 800-171. In fact, only one of the lines from SI4 even shows up in 800-171. Only one of the lines, they broke it into two, and then we took our control enhancement, SI4 parentheses 4, and just bolted it onto the bottom of the requirement and called it one thing. Everything in the middle here was tailored out as being not related to protecting the confidentiality of CUI. So I know it's hard to see here. You should be able to see them in the event guide. Things like identifying unauthorized use of the system, deploying monitoring devices, protecting information obtained from intrusion monitoring tools, from unauthorized access, modification, and deletion. You know who likes to modify and delete information system monitoring data? APTs, right? Heightening the level of your monitoring in response to threat advisories about, you guessed it, APTs, not relevant to protecting CUI confidentiality, yet this baseline that came out is the one that DoD says this protects CUI confidentiality against APTs. You see the contradiction here? Right? So we've got a serious problem, which is why you've heard me huffing and puffing about tailoring more requirements into the baseline, because this is clearly going in the wrong direction, right? All right, so what did the bad guys actually do, right? So NIST just says that the baseline is not adequate for dealing with APTs, but that's just what NIST says. How do we know what the bad guys are actually doing? The 853 catalog doesn't actually have specifics about what Scott does at work all day, right? They don't have any references to specific APT actions. And as it turns out, MITRE, about 11 years ago, came up with their own catalog and dictionary, if you will, called the MITRE Attack Framework, Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. This is literally just a gigantic database. It is equivalent to being the 853 catalog of what bad guys actually do. And so there's a very interesting paper, I encourage everyone to read it, that they put out a couple years ago outlining the philosophy and the design decisions of the MITRE attack framework. And so fundamentally, this framework, which we're going to explain in just a moment, maintains the adversary's perspective. If you crack open 800.171, it talks about two different perspectives on their requirements. Do you know what they are? The federal perspective and the non-federal perspective. You know what they don't have in there? The adversary perspective. We're missing a part. We're missing a piece, right? We have no context to know if the tailoring was actually accurate. So they follow real-world activity through documented empirical examples from lots of different sources, and they abstract it just enough so that it's actually useful to people. You don't need a computer science degree to understand what's going on when you read the entries in the database. So this is what the model would look like if you were to plot it out. So inside of the attack database, they've got adversary groups. These are the APTs that we were talking about, our friends in APT 40 and 41, the IRGC guys. They've got their software tools, their malware that they may use in order to do things. And then they've got tactics, which are going to be the actual high-level goals that they're going after when they're doing bad guy stuff. They want to discover information. They want to persist on your system. They want to move around your network without getting caught. They want to exfiltrate the data from your network. These are tactics that they're going to use. These are the high-level goals that they're going after. The core of the model surrounds the techniques and sub-techniques that they use, the actual things that they do when they try to meet those tactics. So if they're on your computer, they're going to try and dump the logon credentials from that computer so that they can log in as you, or spoof the account, or somehow get account access onto a system, and they just get into more details with the sub-techniques about how those things actually work. And interestingly, there are mitigations listed. So just to stop here, we're talking about actual APTs, nation-state actors, that have had their activity documented for over a decade, and one of the fundamental parts of the model that documents it is how to mitigate that. But most people, when they talk about APTs, just sort of throw up their hands in this fatalistic, giant quitting episode, and they say, their APTs doesn't matter. Their APTs are just going to get in. And if you actually dig into the database that the cyber threat intel people use, or as Scott will actually demonstrate for you later today, you can mitigate to a significant degree the actual things that advanced threat actors do through some pretty simple stuff. See where I'm going here? So as an example to color in the blanks here, this is all in that paper that we referenced earlier, you could take a specific APT group. They could say, we see them use this type of software to execute this specific technique in order to accomplish this specific goal, and these are some specific mitigations that would prevent them from being able to do it. So if you go to the MITRE ATT&CK website, this is what the model looks like when they visualize it. So visualizing the model takes place in something known as the MITRE ATT&CK matrix, and you can click and drill down onto each one of these. If you were to plot this out, I know it's very small and you can't see it, just stick with me. This is what all of the techniques would look like in version 12, which is the relevant one that we're going to talk about today. So there are 14 tactics, which are the top line up here. There's 193 techniques. There's 401 sub-techniques. This is everything that we have seen about the real-world set of the real-world bad guys that you hear about. This is what Michael McLaughlin was talking about. This is what DoD talks about. This is what they're doing. Right? So if we talk about that example that was on that colorful flower chart that we had earlier, and you drill down onto it on the website, we're talking about dumping credentials out of a computer that may be stored in some form of memory, right? And when they do that, they're going to have some specific sub-techniques, and you can read all about the entries for everything the bad guys do. They're very straightforward. You do not have to be technical to understand what's going on. They're very well cited. I would encourage everyone, if you want to get more familiar with what actual security looks like, read the entries in this database. Now, what's interesting is when you click on that specific example, it just so happens that our friends APT 41 have been seen doing that example, right? This is actually what they do. It's one of the examples of what they do. Okay, but then as you go down, there's all these mitigations. The Chinese guys who are trying to hack into the networks that the FBI will arrest on site can be stopped if you do these things. And even if there's a certain situation where they're abusing the natural way that the system operates, you can still detect them, right? Now, one thing to stop here and note is you may have heard of something called a zero-day exploit. APTs are more than zero-day exploits. A zero-day exploit is an exploit for which there is no known patch yet. It's like an unknown vulnerability that they have a working exploit for. This is just a thing that APTs get to do because they've got a lot of time and Mountain Dew like we talked about. So their ability to get into the network and compromise things, pretty good. You're probably not going to be able to prevent them from getting in, right? But detecting and or mitigating them once they're in is 100% possible, pretty much most of the time. And you can go to the attack database and you can either search by the APT group, the technique, the mitigation, you can chop it up whichever way you want to. The point is, they're not invincible. So this is the one that stopped me in my tracks. As I'm reading this paper that lots of people haven't read, remember, we tailored the moderate baseline down because we're only worried about the data's confidentiality. We're not worried about the rest of the CIA triad. We don't need all that other stuff. We don't need all these extra control items. We don't need all these extra controls. We're just talking about data confidentiality. Well, if you ask the MITRE attack people, they say the types of tactics that the bad guys use have been historically aligned to covering adversaries primarily focused on breaching data confidentiality. So, you see where I'm going here? There's lots of people nodding, right? If this is a documented set of techniques for what they do when they're trying to compromise data confidentiality, then it is a perfect comparison to say, if it connects to the requirements that we're implementing, then we have real-world mitigations for what the bad guys are actually doing. And if they don't connect, we have a problem. Spoiler alert, it's a little bit of both, right? So it just so happens that you take these two gigantic databases, 853 and MITRE ATT&CK, and you try to map them together and your head explodes. So the smart people at MITRE decided to go ahead and do it for us. And as it just so happens, they put a nice web available front end to their GitHub database online a week ago. Like, no joke, actually a week ago. Procrastination pays again, right? So they've been working on this project for like 4 years. You can now go to the Center for Threat-Informed Defense, and you can see their rationale for mapping MITRE ATT&CK to 853 controls for all the reasons that we're talking about. Oops. So if you go to the Mappings Explorer page, you can just Google it, MITRE Mappings Explorer. You can sort by 853 control. You can sort by specific technologies. You can sort by APT. You can do all sorts of mappings. You can export it into Excel, which I all know we love, right? But the data for the mappings is there. They explain their methodology, which I won't get into the details of, but I read through all of it, and I'm a firm believer that they know what they're talking about. And they even apply mapping scope. They say, well, we're not just going to map one for one every single control and every single enhancement in the database, in the 853 database, because that would be absurd. There are certain constraints that make some more applicable than others. And so I apologize for the busy chart, just stick with me. If we take that same overlay of the moderate baseline from 853, the purple squares being the ones that should be in 800-171, and you apply MITRE's scope for their analysis, only the columns that start in green are going to be controls that, in their opinion, will actually help to theoretically mitigate the advanced persistent threat. Anything in those other columns, in their opinion, is out of scope for operationally mitigating attack techniques that bad guys use. That does not mean they're not important. Auditing and logging is obviously extremely important, but that's after the fact. They're talking about actually mitigating when they're on the network doing things. And so we took this moderate baseline and cut it down to the purple controls, and then took those purple controls and cut them down even further. And then MITRE says, actually, only these green columns are the ones that would even help you. And if you may notice, we're missing some. So what we've done here is we've said, this is what should happen with the 853 moderate baseline. Dealing with APTs, we should be drawing from the rest of this catalog in order to supplement the moderate baseline in some way, and we did not do that. We went the opposite direction and cut a bunch of pieces out. Then we said, okay, well, maybe it doesn't matter. What do the bad guys actually do? They've actually been documenting that for a very long time in the language of mitigation. And then we said, well, how do we connect the dots? MITRE did the hard work for us, which we can go online and verify. And so now when you sort through the 853 Rev4 controls mapped to MITRE ATT&CK, you'll notice that with the results with at least 100 mappings, controls that map to at least 100 known bad guy techniques in the real world, there are 16 853 controls. SI4, like I said, it's a purposeful example, is the top result. SI4 will help detect and or mitigate up to 350 of the 400 some odd real world techniques, don't take it from me, Scott's going to show you, right? Of the things that the spooky bad guys actually do in real life. So, question for the audience. We talked about how we took all this information out of the moderate baseline. How many of these controls, these 16 controls, do you think are in the moderate baseline starting point that NIST didn't intend to deal with APTs, by the way? How many things do you think show up in the moderate baseline? Banana, good answer. Every single one of them. 63% or 68% of the mappings that MITRE, not NIST, came up with in their independent analysis that will help in some way mitigate the spooky bad guys that everybody says can't be mitigated, exist in the starting point that wasn't even intended to deal with them to begin with. So, another pop quiz. How many of those do you think got colored purple and showed up in 800-171? Any guesses? Banana? All but one. All but one. So if anybody wants to say compliance doesn't equal security, find me after class and we'll fight. Because there are lots of citations that show when you do this work, caveat, just because you have them implemented doesn't mean you get to stop, right? Actually implementing system monitoring requires professionals to do actual things that are challenging, right? It's a skill, it's a craft. Working in cybersecurity is a thing that people do their entire careers. You still have to do the work, but there isn't some thing that is a set of other controls that are different from compliance that then magically become security, right? You cannot get any closer to real security than saying, what are the top things that the real bad guys do? And are they mitigatable? Yes. Are they detectable? Yes. What are the controls that, to the largest degree, would map to that set of bad guy techniques? Here they are. And they ended up in the moderate baseline, and then they ended up in your requirements in 800-171. And then the DoD comes by, and they say, we're going to have CMMC verify that you've implemented it. And everybody goes, I don't think it's going to work. Now remember, go back to the beginning. NIST never intended for these baselines to deal with APTs by default. And I'm pretty sure that DoD didn't know that, right? So when they came out and they said, ooga booga, you got to do CMMC because China, right? They hadn't done the mappings. They didn't really know what the case was. Terry, feel free to correct me later if I'm wrong here. They sort of inadvertently said, do these things and it will help without really knowing to what degree it would help. And as it turns out, everybody doubted them, and they were way more right than even I thought they would be. Because in fairness, right, people who are familiar with the controls and generally familiar with security, they're like, yeah, logging, auditing, system monitoring, granular access control, network segmentation, these make security sense. I know they do things. I know they have security value. But in fairness to people who are like, how much? You can't really quantify it. You don't really know off the top of your head because NIST doesn't tell you. But MITRE does, and now we've got both sides of the coin. So this idea that there's no security value to CMMC, that it's just some arbitrary compliance exercise program for which you get nothing for your time and effort, is absolutely 100% not true. So does anybody have a guess for what you get for doing even just CMMC level 1? Better than nothing. It's better than nothing. I was actually surprised that any of them were on there. Right? It's actually pretty incredible. Now, is someone just implementing CMMC level 1 going to be able to do some sick kung fu and stop Chinese APT actors? No, right? But it does do something. It is a starting point, right? You have to start somewhere. Did they intend for that to be the perfect maturity model, the perfect starting point? Absolutely not. It is a coincidence of government policy and rulemaking and random decisions and FIPS documents and all this other stuff. And through the magic of all of those coincidences, we ended up with a pretty good baseline. It can be improved, but people putting the baseline down, we're going to start talking about this a lot more through Summit 7 content. And it's not going to be fun for the people who are like, it's compliance. Okay, so what have we not talked about? We haven't talked about 800-172 or CMMC level 3. I'm going to take a drink of water real quick because this one's a little rough. The good news is 800.172 is getting ready to be revised. That's very, very good news. The bad news is the next chart is going to make you have an aneurysm. Okay, I know. Just relax. All right, so we took the moderate baseline, and then we colored in the boxes to be purple for the things that are in 171. And then we put the yellow stars for the things that are in CMMC level 1. The orange boxes are all of the things that NIST added via 172. Notice 172 did not color the non-purple boxes purple, right? So we started at the baseline that was supposed to get added to, we cut away from it, and then when we went to go add stuff back, we added different stuff from what we cut away. Great job, right? So because we know the difference between a base control and a control enhancement, what you'll notice is that a lot of these orange boxes, you should have access to the slides to take a closer look later on, are in parentheses, which means almost all of the requirements and enhancements in 172 are enhancements to existing base controls. So they took the things that they decided were relevant to CUI confidentiality, and then to deal with the APT threat in 172, they just reinforced those same things and basically just doubled down on the holes that we had poked in the moderate baseline to begin with when we designed 171. But wait, there's more. To make matters worse, as we know, DoD isn't requiring you to use all of the 66 requirements in 800.172. They're only requiring you to do 24 of them, right? And so this subset, or I'm sorry, the 35 requirements that are in 800.172, they're requiring you to do a subset. So even though this is a not good supplementation of the baseline to deal with APTs based off what we learned earlier, DoD is then doing even less via CMMC level 3. That needs to get fixed. So this is what I said, where we sort of inadvertently stumbled into a good 171 standard, and then we did not do a good job with 172 or CMMC level 3. But 172 is changing. The revision process is going to start after 171 Rev 3 is published. So we're going to have a bunch of great tailoring advice for the DoD with our newfound knowledge of the connection between 853 and MITRE ATT&CK to make a more effective standard, right? Right. Okay, so key takeaways. I've got takeaways for industry, I've got takeaways for NIST, I've got takeaways for DoD. For you, for industry, my people, you need to cross-reference the 853 controls to the 800.171 requirements. I know that sounds insane. I know they don't require you to do this. I know they took those bits out and they aren't mandated by 800.171 right now, but as we saw through the example, the most common control that maps to the largest number of real-world bad guy attacks has been completely hollowed out. You're missing a whole bunch of the one thing that if you were going to focus on anything should probably be that one thing. No one's going to make you do it until maybe one day all that stuff gets put back in. If you actually want to convert these compliance requirements into security, the answer is not to throw them away. It's to go back to 53 and see what MITRE saw and say there's actually value here. From there, I would encourage you to leverage the details that are in MITRE ATT&CK. Everything that's in detection and mitigation for each of these techniques, right? There are specific examples in there for tuning and configuring your control environments to detect and mitigate the real world activity that's happening, right? So if you see the NIST controls and they seem nebulous and it doesn't really tell you what to do, that's the missing piece that will help you know more of what you're looking to do. And I would encourage everyone to participate in the 172 revision process, going to be happening the second half of this year. The big question is, should security requirements be tailored based on their mapping to MITRE ATT&CK if 172 is designed to be the document that's supposed to stop the APTs from getting the data? And the attack techniques are the ones that are, when the bad guys try to get the data, they do these things. I think so, but that's what the comment period will be for. Okay, for NIST, my other favorite people. Is it time to overhaul the baseline starting points in SP 853? You told us that the starting baselines in the catalog of all catalogs is not designed to deal with APTs. We now know, many, many years later, what the actual adversary perspective looks like, and we have to do extra steps to get to the correct starting point. It kind of, to me, begs the question, shouldn't we just start there and then decide to take things out sort of opting in rather than opting out from the starting point that everybody's going to use for security? Think about it. Ron, Vicky, think about it. Okay, so MITRE's analysis appears to fundamentally disagree with the nature of confidentiality threat mitigation for data. I hope that in SB 800-171 Rev 4, it's going to expand to meet the threat. Tailoring things out of the moderate baseline was a mistake, right? It was a mistake if you read the book of how tailoring is supposed to work, in my opinion. It was clearly a mistake. If you don't believe me, you go talk to MITRE, right? When the bad guys do stuff, they do these. NIST says you can't start here, you got to add things. We took stuff out, bad. Don't do that anymore. The problem here, as you may have guessed, that means the standard has to get bigger. All the boxes that weren't purple need to be purple. All the boxes that are orange probably also need to be purple, right? Everyone's been nodding along like, yeah, we're going to fight the bad guys. You going to spend the money? 171's already backbreaking, right? It's already crazy expensive. CMMC is going to have to verify more stuff. They're going to take longer. It's going to cost more money. Careful what you wish for. Something to think about. These are takeaways. They're not actually, I don't actually have to follow up on them. Okay, last point here for NIST. SB 800-171 contains the federal perspective, the non-federal perspective. Please, like Joy was saying, make 171 and 171A the same document. Please include in that document the missing part of the triad here. The real triad is not the CIA triad, it's these three perspectives. Without that MITRE attack data freely and publicly available, this isn't a beta project anymore. There's no starting context. No one in their right mind is going to go recreate this analysis of connecting all these dots between random papers and projects, right? That's what I get paid to do. Normal people aren't going to do that. Just put it in the document, please. Okay, for DoD, will CMMC Level 3 ever match your rhetoric? Fair question, right? You know that we're trying to fight the APTs. I know you're constrained by your authorities because we've aligned directly to NIST standards, but you're talking a big game, and when you look under the covers, we're missing some bits. It's fine, it does a lot of good things, but CMMC Level 3 is your choice. You chose to do less than what the baseline in 172 says. At the very least, you require all of it, right? Are we going to actually match the rhetoric and do what we say we want to do? For you, Terry, for DC3, for DCICE, for the DIBCS program, the quarterly advisories that you guys put out map to MITRE tactics. They don't include MITRE attack techniques. What I think would be super duper cool is the quarterly reports from DIB companies participating in reporting incidents get characterized as MITRE attack techniques. Those get rolled up and put out in your your quarterly reports mapped to via MITRE's data. We're not charging you for the data, calm down. MITRE's free data, the controls in 800-171 that would help mitigate the most common activity seen in the DIB for that quarter, right? When CISA puts out their joint alerts, which I know you all get, your assessors are going to ask you, they put out MITRE attack techniques for activity that's seen, and then they put out their mapping to their own version of requirements, which is super annoying because you got to go through and translate them. They're not connected. It's super annoying. If DoD puts out this information, because now the DIBCS program is open to everyone to participate in, then we have a wonderful feedback loop here. So I'm actually including industry here on a DoD takeaway. If nothing else, if you want the standards to get better, if you want compliance and security to continue to merge closer together, you have to participate in the DIBCS program. It is voluntary, but when you participate in the DIBCS program and you report what's happening to you, Terry can aggregate that information, characterize it by attack, link it to the requirements you're forced to implement, and then you know where you need to focus your energy, right? So over time, the standard gets better as NIST is revising it. It becomes more relevant and targeted to the actual activity that is happening in the DIB. We don't have to go through CISA and translate whatever they're interested in, right? They just opened the program. Another wonderful coincidence. For the first time in its 12-year history, 16, sorry. For the first time, 20 years, it's even worse. For the first time in almost 20 years, unclassified, uncleared defense contractors can participate in this information sharing program in addition to all the tools. I think the one thing that the DoD could do I don't know if you've read the DIB cyber strategy. It ain't the best. The one thing that we can all do, participate in the program, and then you report the MITRE attack techniques out to everybody, and then the circle of life continues from there, and everything will start to improve. Okay, so that's the end of that session. Now we're going to get into questions. It wasn't so bad.
Everyone seems scared. All right, raise your hand. You got it, Scott.
Angel Flores here. That was great, Jacob. Thanks for that. And as we talk about APTs, right, understanding that for especially 853 covers a lot more than just the APTs and other things, how much do you think the DIB should be concerned with insider threat, which is another, if not probably the top threat to information, with other controls just as SI3 and others that MITRE attack might not focus on, or does MITRE cover some of that?
Off the top of my head, there isn't a MITRE attack sort of subset for specifically insider threat. I would actually tell you to talk to Joy, because she's the insider threat expert on our team. But it's a good point, because insider threat's a huge threat vector. MITRE attacks sort of specifically on APT tools and techniques, but it's an awesome point, something else to consider for the DoD DIB CS team. Especially for small manufacturers, sensitive IP, sensitive CUI, especially all of you that may or may not be using outsourced SOCs and MSPs that are not compliant, right? Insider threat's a huge deal, so it's definitely an area for more research.
Hi, you spend a lot of time talking about everything that was taken out of 800-53 to be able to create 800-171. But to be able to bridge over to the speaker yesterday, Mike McLaughlin, he actually spoke about, it wasn't about just stealing the data, it was about changing the data and leaving it there.
Yep.
When do you sit there and see the DoD and stuff starting to put in that integrity of data piece versus just the confidentiality?
Yeah, it's a good point. And as you'll look through the slides as well, especially if you read through that paper, when we talked about those 14 techniques across the top of the MITRE attack matrix, the one all the way on the right-hand side, impact, those are the techniques and the sub-techniques, the software and everything associated with destructive attacks, right? Data wiping, things like that, integrity and availability attacks. So if you're curious, you can figure out what the bad guys are doing on that side. Those also map to 853 controls. So theoretically, DoD could come out and say, this is a huge deal, we want to apply a subset of controls on top. Now, if you remember your history, CMMC 1.0 tried to do that. With the Delta 20, they said, oh, there's actual threats, and we're going to take things that are not in 800-171, and we're going to bolt it on top. We're going to tailor controls in, and what happened? They got absolutely spanked, right? And that's when they went back for 2 years, and they said, we're not going to add anything. We're going to align directly to what NIST says, because that's a safe place to be. We can just point to what the rules are. So you'd have to convince NIST that their data confidentiality standard needs to include insider threat controls. You would need to figure out their data security standard needs to deal with data destruction techniques and things like that. All tailoring decisions. You guys have heard me talk about this endlessly. Whatever you think the threat and the risk is, there's probably controls and enhancements in 853 that deal with it in some way, but getting it into the baseline is a function of tailoring, right? So you have to convince them to tailor them in, or maybe tailor them out, right? So when the revision process happens, don't just be a passive observer and be like, whoa, it's a compliance standard, doesn't do the thing anymore. The problem is, right, you start tailoring in controls for insider threat, data destruction, data wiping, APT 30, 29, 28, all these guys, it's going to get really big really fast. And then pretty soon you start recreating the entire 853 catalog. So, where do you draw the line? That's the game, right? That's the tailoring game. But you have to know the rules of the game to be able to make those recommendations.
All right, so online question, and then Terry will come to you. This one's relevant to Terry. So question from online, will DC3/DibCS have to be CMMC certified since they will have SPD?
No.
Terry's going crazy, everyone.
No.
Awesome. Terry, your turn.
Terry Kelka, DC3, the privilege of leading the DICE team. Long-time listener.
Give it up for Terry, everybody.
Caller.
This is the guy.
Maybe you should wait to hear what I say before you applaud. I will not address the top bullet there, because I will get yelled at by a lot of people if I try. However, I will share an online observation from Mary Schmelke that probably as long as we're, well, the observation is and you alluded to this, Jacob, is that if DoD ever attempted, let me just say, a maturity model or compliance framework that matched what we're saying about true advanced persistent threat, what we've seen so far is the voluminous pushback from industry and from Congress and from many stakeholders makes that really unlikely, in my personal opinion.
Yeah.
That's not an official statement, but that's the reality of where we are is, you know, we're all energized, especially everybody who saw the opening talks yesterday. We're all like, yeah, we got to do this. We put stuff out, and the pushback on what's possible and what's impossible for industry to achieve is tremendous. So it's a really complicated problem. I definitely don't have an answer to it. Addressing the next bullet and then the question. Yes, I'm taking that as an action to look into. We have a fairly...
Yeah, give it up for Terry, the DOD taking a suggestion. Hey!
Yes. So we walk a fine line because historically, one of the reasons to join the program is that we're going to give you information that you're not going to get if you're not in the program. That said, there's also tremendous value to the public in being clear about what we're seeing and how it's happening. So there's policy I got to consult. There's stuff we have to look into, but I'm certainly going to look into that and see what we can make happen. Will DC3 be CMMC compliant? The quick answer is no, because we are not contractors. We are a federal agency. We are actually held to 853 and DoD impact level 4, which is stronger than FedRAMP moderate. And we don't have the luxury of 72 hours to report a cyber incident. We have 24 hours or less. And it gets the attention of very senior level people in government much more quickly than anything from the DIB. So I would argue that, no, we are not going to be CMMC certified because that doesn't apply to government agencies. And our requirements are pretty darn strong.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, so just to summarize, I think the same phenomenon that people have seen, the bad guys will do stuff and people go, oh my God, we have to stop it. And then Congress will go, do something, do something. And then we'll come out with recommendations for mitigating the activity. And then people will see the amount of work and money and they'll go, not like that. And then we'll sort of sit around and wait for something bad to happen. And they'll go, do something, do something. And then you'll see the recommendations and then the money and the effort. And they go, not like that either. And then we just go around and around and around and one day the lights go off. Who has more questions?
Jacob, got one over here.
Yes, sir.
And then we can come over there, Scott.
Hi, Jacob. This is Joy Beelan from Summit 7.
Hi. Hi.
Thank you. Every time you do this, my head explodes. One of the things that my eyes immediately go to is all of the red columns. Mm-hmm. When you're looking at what MITRE is doing in mapping the attacks over to what's in there. Thank you. And I'm not seeing awareness and training, which for me...
Well, so just I'm glad you brought that up. So just to sort of reiterate, so their methodology here was to say which controls would mitigate the operational activity when the APT is on your network. So things like training do have security value. Things like auditing do have security value. No one say anything when I say this. Policies and procedures have security value, right? But they don't actively do anything when they're on the network, right? They're a part they're part of your broader set of your control environment. They have value and reasons for being there. But as far as MITRE saying, they're like, which specific things can you do to neutralize their software, their on-keyboard technique, the goal that they're going after? And when you go through their criteria for analyzing it, they end up saying, well, training is important, but saying you go through training doesn't actually do anything when they're dumping creds out of memory, right?
Thank you. Yeah. I won't storm the MITRE building now.
Yeah, okay, yeah. It is a specific lens on the 853 catalog. I had a bunch of other slides about that differentiation, but we don't have the time, so we can talk about it afterwards, or you come to the next CS2, maybe we'll talk about it there. Let me know.
Relis Amilcrane, Bristol Bay Native Corporation. I have a quick question about the responsibilities of the data for the contractor in a post-incident analysis scenario.
Okay.
The forensics team that's brought in that conducts the investigation, are we responsible for how they control and manage the data? Or is that no longer our problem? Is it privileged?
So you're asking, is it the forensic investigator's responsibility for how your client handles the data, or for how?
No. So let's say like I'm part of an organization and I'm conducting a post-incident analysis, and their forensics team, however they do things, they may not be under CMMC compliance for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Let's say that their investigation stores data at a SOC in London, for example.
Yep.
Would that be or would that axe them out as a potential?
Depends on how the DoD is going to approach the definition of security protection data. The way the CMMC proposed rule is written, it makes it sound like security protection data is a category of CUI, at which point you would be implicated in making sure that your requirements are implemented, because if you're taking that SPD data out of the network and sending it off somewhere, the controls need to follow the data. But it'll depend on how they tweak or not the definition of SPD in the final rule, which should be out. Well, Matt Travis told us to be out the end of the year, so I'm going to go ahead and say that. Sorry, Matt.
I want to piggyback during those forensics investigations. Many times the actual data itself is taken, and if it is CUI, then it would need to be protected because you would be responsible for giving it to that person. So you would need to protect that CUI.
Jacob, you want to do a couple more?
Yeah, we still got 2 minutes. We started a little late, so if anybody has questions, we can go
All right.
a little longer, but not
online
too much.
question here. All right.
Sorry, Sam, let me interrupt you. If anybody has questions about, I know it's not a rulemaking talk, thank God, right? If anybody has questions about the rulemaking, feel free to ask them as well. You don't have to just keep to here, but just to put that out there. If anybody has burning questions about rulemaking, it is my favorite thing.
All right, this one comes from Robert online. Looking at the critical controls from MITRE, do you see managed service providers being able to easily address these?
I would say that the reason why managed service providers make so much sense in terms of implementing any set of requirements is because necessarily the kinds of companies that are being regulated are below what we call the cybersecurity poverty line, right? CISA tries to make it sound nicer by saying target rich, resource poor. It basically means you don't have the internal staff to do cybersecurity stuff. You don't have the budget, you don't have the money, you don't have the expertise, you don't have the ability to negotiate your agreements and requirements from external parties. You're below a certain line of influence. Now that's fine because small businesses aren't going to usually carry internal cybersecurity staffs. We don't all have 5 people to sort of get ready. It makes business sense to outsource your requirements to a managed provider, just regardless of what your situation is. It just makes economic sense. Now what ends up happening is if your MSP, which they should, your assessors are going to ask about it, has a shared responsibility matrix, what you will notice is that each of these requirements, the way that a NIST control is broken down, has a technical, operational, execution side and a policy and management side within the same control. You can't outsource the authorization, the responsibility, the ultimate accountability for whether the controls are happening. When you use an external service provider, you're typically outsourcing the technical work to be done because that's what you're paying them for. What we know from the mappings to the MITRE attack techniques, like Joy was saying, we're only talking about the technical things that need to be done. If you go look in the MITRE matrix, the attack matrix, and look at some of the actual mitigations of technical things to do on keyboard, that's exactly what you would be paying your service provider or your security service provider to do. So theoretically, to answer the question, every single thing in here that addresses real-world techniques are the things that you are paying your service provider to do, even if they don't know it, right? Yeah, to a certain extent, that is exactly what you're paying them to do. Ryan in the back?
Oh.
I don't know if you want to give that guy a mic.
Yeah.
Ryan?
This is more of a question that I'm asking you just as a dog whistle to all the C3PAOs who might be listening in. So you have these assessments that now, because of the new CMMC proposed final rule, have to include assessing 800-171 requirements for security protection assets and also for these external service provider assets, and then also contractor risk managed assets. Do you think that sampling specifically from the controls on the screen right now would be a great subset to focus on for those other asset types that are not directly handling CUI in an effort to have a more cost-effective assessment that still shows you that people are doing the right things?
Yes.
Oh, hey, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. My opinion is that this infinite chain, as Amir Arman says, this sort of infinite chaining phenomenon of saying security protection data, security protection assets are just going to cause this infinite chaining of the controls go to you and to you and to you and to everybody until the heat death of the universe because you happen to provide protection to an environment that handles CUI. I don't personally agree with that language in 800.171, but NIST doesn't appear like they're eager to change it. So if we are stuck in that subpar situation, then yes, if you're going to spot check controls internally, externally, for whatever reason, these are probably the ones that you're going to want to check because they're the ones that map to the actual bad guy techniques. Okay. Let's see here. Let's get to the agenda for what's happening after lunch. If there's no more questions, we did it, everybody. We were only 2 minutes over.
Applause.
Hey! All right. So after lunch, we're going to go into the breakouts just like yesterday. Executive breakouts in this room, technical breakouts in the room next door. In this room after lunch at 2 o'clock will be a session on the FedRAMP memo, everybody's favorite. But the twist is a session on the FedRAMP memo from people who like it, So, well, if you're curious, you should check it out. And then in the room next door, the technical breakout, the follow-on to this session on what MITRE attack techniques actually look like in real life and what happens when you try to make Scott Goodwin's job harder. Executives in here, technicals over there. You have until 2 o'clock. Thanks for coming. See you then.